Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Sutcliffe, and I'm delighted to be sharing this platform and particularly engaging with two of my comrades and colleagues of many years. The one is Yunus Karim, who's got a long history of involvement, not just in the democratic movement, in the South African Communist Party and the ANC, member of parliament, but also as really an activist academic at the University of Natal in those days, now called University of KwaZulu-Natal, and the institutions there. Secondly, Lechisa Tsanoli came into both of our lives, mine and Yunus, particularly in the 1980s in that struggle as one of our leaders within the UDF. And his life of living in Lamontville, which was, one of those township areas that was caught betwixt and between because Buthelezi and the IFP were continually wanting to incorporate it into the KwaZulu Bantustan. And there was lots of resistance arising from there. But also then he became one of our national leaders in the United Democratic Front. If I have a little bit of a sense of their history wrong, I'm sure they'll correct me. They have been my leaders for many years. So I thought it's broadly going to be three parts to this podcast. So I'll be quite careful that we don't start getting too much beyond 1998 and the launch of the white paper. We will end off with some reflections at the end there, just in some of the themes that in that 1998 white paper were reflected there. But what we'll do is each of us just touch on some of our political lineage, the struggles of, certainly in my case, the 1980s onwards, and how that influenced what we really had to do come liberation, what was called the post-apartheid South Africa studies that we were involved with, then the negotiations for the interim constitution and the final constitution in the 1980s. And then obviously once we had that, the white paper itself, how that needed to be formulated based on often real civic struggles occurring there. The second part of that would obviously be the rationale leading up to the 1998 white paper, where really when you read it today, it really embodied this thinking that we had there, that local government will consist of two broad groupings, one arising out of those civic movements. The UDF galvanized much of that, and those would often be your ward council levels, and then the political parties would be the PR level of local government. And if you read the document today, you'll see to a certain extent that was a conceptualization there. And then the third area, but certainly both Yunus and Lechisa were critical in that process. Excuse me. And then the third, is how those frameworks shaped where we are today. Cool. So colleagues, really what happened in the 1980s, from my perspective, was the growth of, after the 76 and actually 1973, the worker movements, the civic movements, the launch of the UDF, and really the consolidation of those four parts of the liberation struggle in the 1980s, really operating in every part of the country, struggles against the apartheid state. And those struggles were over transport boycotts, rent boycotts, etc. So here let me ask Lechisa to come into the conversation. Tell us a bit about those civic movements that we had then.
Let me start slightly elsewhere, Mike. That is that I was a journalist of sorts. I misrepresented myself and felt guilty for a long time. When a boy asked me, what am I doing? And I said, I'm writing. What in fact I was expressing was a wish that I do so. I went straight to a newspaper editor of the Friend publication in Bloemfontein, and he challenged me to go and write. That's how I started a bit of freelancing of sorts, a little bit of writing, not much at the time, but subsequently got me involved with struggles around the media and those related issues. One of the senior journalists in Bloemfontein was a motor journalist. He sent us to the PAN conference in Wellspread, which is where I also met many activists with strong views of one kind or another. And it was very impressive in that sense. I mentioned that because it then began to inform the work that I did. I used to distribute Staff Rider magazine. And when I went to Durban in the late 70s, I was selling Staff Rider, distributing it. but also interacting with journalists we met over there. The important thing is that subsequent to that, I got to meet some comrades in Natal, in Durban, who then subsequently to, and the attraction, by the way, between each other was jazz. We love jazz. But as soon as we started talking jazz, we started talking about the revolutionary work that was underway. And so I got persuaded to join the strike. In fact, that was my little invitation to join the cell of the Organizational Congress around Durban. And so it was an interesting opportunity because we started looking at structures that existed then and then decided that we needed to transform the youth organization into a more socially active and sharper politically organization than perhaps it was before. What then began to happen was that we became, what do you call it, the thin edge into the organizing work that was already happening underground, unknown to some of us. We came to know about it later, but it had a major impact in mobilizing the young people of the township and then interacting with other young people elsewhere around the Durban functional area, as we used to call it. So the work of organizing then spread into civic structures, resident staff. What's his name? Mbongening was Asinamali. He actually walked over to my place where I used to stay to consult, having recruited one of the young people for theater work. And we gave him a briefing on the Asinamali story, which he then turned into a powerful medium, so to speak, theatrical. That was an interesting thing, not only because of the angle it was taking us to, of involving the arts in the campaigns we were mounting in the township, but it also exposed us to ways of communicating that were very effective at civic level amongst people. When you listen to the Sawa Sinamali, you can hear why many residents would really resonate with its message. That work was powerful in that it also made effective the sort of working around the town, the general townships in David. We went to one old man, to go and consult about the original civic structure. But he told us, no, man, what will that damn thing do? Why must we accept such a structure when we have the ANC to do? What will it be doing? And so he was very not nice in his reaction to our intention to do deepen civic organization and thereby of necessity making the work of working with broader people more different sectors. And that's how when we joined the UDF, we actually set up the mechanism. We met, Mike, in Cape Town somewhere, some restaurant called Missiles, I think, or something like that, where we discussed the idea of how do we knit these structures we were creating to create a plan that will take our struggles forward, because there was a huge debate going on externally about the nature and the form of the struggles to take. One of them, to summarize, was focusing on the necessity for organization, deep organization on the ground, and the other was on insurrectionary, the path towards final victory. So we were very excited about working on the ground in the organizational creation of civic structures to interact with many different people in those communities, but also in the organizations, professional organizations and other associations that were progressive, seeking changes in their own structures. And with the trade unions, you were very clear that the reason for us fighting for lower rents, if at all, was because the workers were earning very low wages. And so we came to the conclusion that solidarity and work with trade unions was a necessary work that civic should be conducting, build the coherence across these two. So it laid the foundation effectively for campaigning, not only, for example, through not only as a rent, boycotts of sorts, Zimba chips, when they were boycotted, and other consumer goods got themselves into the work we were doing. but it was an important knitting together of what otherwise would have been seen as different struggles. And those were very important teaching of front politics and working together with deep convergences, even as there were other differences that pushed us elsewhere. So it was a fascinating kilo that time that gave us that opportunity. With the UDF in place, you would remember that our attempts to create a national structure in order to coordinate the sort of campaigns we wanted to do, even as there were deep local issues, was an important one, but was thwarted by the launch of the state of emergency, and thereby exiling many comrades and throwing others deep underground. And so our initial efforts to build a national civil structure to coordinate our way around local government was thwarted in that way during that period. But
Yes.
that's the set of places, I think, that led us to then. The reason behind structuring our work around civics was that there were already existing residents' association in many other parts of the country anyway. The ultra-leftist Baruch used to write a lot about those uh, residents' organizations and so on. In fact, from the Free State, what's his name? The old man who married Josimba Sanyana was organizing in the Potchefstroom area residents against difficulties. But that was the kind of structures that led us in the direction. This is the path to go. What we need in the Sanko structure that I came to lead, to summarize it as seeking genuine democratic governance. That language was significant not only because it sought to include broader work in the quality of democracy that we wanted to see, unlike what we had experienced. And so its call for being a genuine democratic governance was sufficiently deep to inspire a lot of other work that was happening in the working with the United States.
No, thanks very much for that. A very good introduction there, my good comrade Lachis. That brings back many good memories, because that early period, and I think in a sense what you're also saying here is how important that early 1980s was with the launch of the UDF, because all of these struggles we were doing, relatively speaking, in isolation. While the ANC tried to coordinate some of that, there was still a belief that it was the seizure of power thesis. I'm mentioning some of these because Eunice, I'm sure, will elaborate a bit on some of that more, let's call it, ideological foundations of the work that we did. But this allowed us to understand the commonalities of the fact that the apartheid regime was hitting us at civics, at worker, at every facet of our life was being hit there. And of course, with the launch of the UDF, that's when I first started hearing about this. A little bit later, Yunus Karim of the world, because we established on the campus a joint academic staff association between Pietermaritzburg and the campus of Pietermaritzburg and Durban. And we became, in fact, the only academic staff association that formally affiliated to the UDF. And through that, then one started hearing of comrades. We'll be mentioning a lot of outstanding comrades of ours who worked with us, whether it's a Praveen Gordon and Vish Supasad and Jabu Satoli in an eThekwini context, or in fact your Colin Gardners and your Yusuf Bamjis, who we laid to rest recently there. So this was another boiling pot of conditions on the ground in Pietermaritzburg that really led to the rise of a real stalwart of ours, Yunus Karim. So maybe, Yunus, give us some reflections of your life as it hit you as an academic, as an activist, as a thinker, and then obviously your later life on the Central Committee of the party.
Yeah, very quickly, I first became politically active in 1971, and we formed an organization called Youth Movement Today to oppose racist education. We wanted a changed education system as part of a non-racial democratic South Africa. And then we were drawn to our attention that there's an organization called National Youth Action in Cape Town. People might know Farid Isak. I think Ashraf will know him and others. And of course, he was with you in the UDF leadership in some form or another, Lechisa. So, from there, well, we got detained for organizing an anti-Republic Day demonstration on the 31st of May, 1971. It was a silly demonstration, about 10 or 12 of us. But you must remember, Indian people, Coloureds are extremely conservative as well. So my very own classmates all said, no, it's Yunus. One started crying and saying to the deputy, no, Yunus is behind it. So they said, yeah, we know that. So they hauled me in and they scolded me and took me to my mother. I didn't have a father there. And my mother said, just give him a good hiding and all. There isn't time to talk about all that. So that was my initial political involvement. And then, contrary to what people in Maritzburg and elsewhere think, I wasn't interrogated and detained by the police. I was barely called in by Sergeant Naidu, who said to me, you know, you don't have a father. And your mother is a welfare case. Politics is not for you, it's for Dr. Motala. But Dr. It's dirty, not for you, you don't have a father. So he gave me funny advice. But you will hear from my school friends, I was not tortured. Now when they talk about, they say he was detained when he was 16. Nothing, man. You know, you guys know the Harry Gwala Stadium, that Alexandra Park. That's where they took me, not to Loop Street Police Station. So anyway, then of course, I went to the Natal Indian Congress conference in 73, I think, at the Gandhi Library, just to observe it. That's where I first encountered people like Ves and Praveen. I didn't know them. I was just observing as a school student. And then, of course, I went on to UDW. And then in 1976, Rashid Mills, Lloyd Padhyati and I were detained following the student unrest. And we were transferred to Mordaby prison. There, too, the students thought we were being electrocuted and so on. Nothing, man. They gave us a few slaps and they put me on the table. They said the most humiliating thing was, can you make a speech? So I used to memorize the sociology notes. Michael, sociology 1, the Skumbi used to cycle style and he used to pay for. So I was saying, culture is a set of norms, values, and beliefs. And they said, no, where's the Amandla? So I had to say, culture is a set of norms, beliefs, values, Amandla. And they were laughing at me. Look, I'll leave all that. Out of that detention of 5.5 months, we weren't tortured or anything, but ended up with a UN scholarship. And I spent 5 years in Warwick University and did a course in journalism before that, and then came back to the country. And by that time, people like Lechisa and Michael and others were pushing for the UDS formation. But in Msinduswell and Peter Maritzburg, I was seen as a Trotskyite, and that's not true. I was a workerist. I wasn't a Stalinist. That didn't make me a Trotskyite. I became a socialist at a very young age, influenced astonishingly, I think you'll know this, Michael, by A.N. Boyce's book, History, a book that dealt with, do you know it as well, in the Batu education system as well? Yeah, I learned it from the French Revolution and the Russian. This resonated with me. Right? And I love this idea of equality, liberty, and fraternity. I love the idea of you shouldn't be rich and poor and all that. Never mind where I exist now and what life I have, but that's how it was. And in some sense, it still is. So I became a socialist, a Marxist in a more general sense, not a Communist Party member. I was never involved in the underground or anything. And I became active in the Communist Party when it committed itself in some or other form after 1990 to a non-Stalinist approach. I was influenced a lot, as we all, not least our leaders here, UDF leader Lechisa and Michael, by Gramsci's thinking. And when it opened up the Communist Party, I was not part of the underground. I joined it in 1990. And in 1995, I was elected to the Central Committee and Politburo, and I've been there since. And for my sins, I headed Umsebenzi and AC. Let's not talk about the other journalist here and his level of participation, but that's a matter we'll settle outside this meeting, right? But comrades, basically, I got drawn into the civic area, as it's called, when I came back from the UK, partly because they isolated me. Michael Sutcliffe's buddies, Faisal Ismail and Jabu and others, and not least, what's his name, Dabasani and Indu and so on. They saw me, I was very interested in trade unions. I was teaching industrial sociology, so that was my obvious interest. And I drew some very crude parallels, as did others, between, the way Fosato operated, focusing on bread and butter issues and linking it to broader issues, but incrementally, but not taking head on. I was also, on our own, we decided, Praveen and them also, I think, influenced us, was that with the colored community and Indian community, very conservative. But they had legitimate grievances under the apartheid system. The municipal government wasn't delivering to them and so on. And so we decided to focus on issues that directly affect people, bread and butter. And I think the most advanced thinking on that came from actually Praveen Godan in the Durban Housing Action Committee. And we had a similar approach, influenced partly by them, but not substantially by them. We came to those things through our own activism. We decided, let's focus on electricity, water, and inequitable rates was the big issue. So I became secretary initially of the Pietermaritzburg Central Ratepayers and Residents Association, and then later on the combined which was the equivalent of the Durban Housing Action Committee, except that unlike in Durban, we were not non-racial really. It was primarily Indian and colored. There were the odd African people who lived even then in the Indian and colored group areas, but we were primarily Indian and colored. And the big issue was at that stage Africans were not paying rates. What we did in 1988, 89, I can't remember, mobilized close to 10,000 people. That figure comes from the security police, by the way, to protest against inequitable rates because of the pressure on land in the concentrated Indian and colored group areas. Michael knows more about the technicalities of that. Indians and coloreds owning properties of the same size and the same value in literal terms, financial terms, paid very different rates. So the same property, say in the White Scottsville area at that time, you paid far lower rates than in the Indian or so-called colored group area. So that's really mobilized people. It's around bread and butter issues. And of course, almost all the leaders then in the Peter Maritzburg Combined Ratepayers and Residents Association, C.D. Modley was the chair, I was the secretary, A.S. Chetty was chair, was really NIC. Although we had this absurd situation when we met Mark Cornell, who was a liberal mayor, by the way. We were one of the first in the country to begin discussions. I think we preceded Craddock and so on. And it came from a very different vantage point, not the struggle that those people waged, not their consumer power. In our case, it was around inequitable rates and a feeling that if we won over the combined ratepayers, that's a feeling I think of the local state, we could separate them from the more radical struggles we're seeing in Durban and elsewhere. And so it is from a very conservative base and coincidentally a very liberal mayor, Mark Cornell. A sort of like semi-Colin Gardner type, He opened up the door, and the first ever discussions that I know took place in the country, although it's often said it happened in the Eastern Cape over the consumer, but I think happened in Peter Maritzburg, where he said, okay, let's discuss an open city. But then we said, no, we're talking about open city. We mean, what about the Mbali Civic Association? What about the Sabantu Civic Association, Tumasani and Talani and so on? Although they didn't see us as credible. Although in the same UDF structures, they felt rightly we're too Indian-centric, too colored-centric. We're not taking up the issues. But we told them we're not paying rates, so it's hard to mobilize. So there it was. We got involved in that. And then from then, when I went to Parliament in 94, obviously my main interest was local government. And so I joined the local government committee, and 4 years later...
Well, let's touch on that just now. We'll get to the 1990s, because I think you...
Sorry for so long, sorry.
No, but that's very important, the issues of 94. But I think you need to start the discussion of that second area there, talking about the white paper, etc., at that level there. So I think what's emerging out of this was really that period of the 1980s. I can put a few anecdotes just to conceptualize it here. Thabo Mbeki, I think it was last year, was giving a talk to, I think, international people who attend his schools. And one of the admissions he made there, which was a bit of a confession, was that really the leadership of the ANC had never taken local government seriously enough. And particularly around the deployment of leadership there, he was saying that part of the corruption and issues like that we get today was always seen as something that was incidental. And I remember that distinctly because from about the 1986, somewhere around there, I got involved with these post-apartheid South Africa movement that was bringing together how we could think about the health, think about local government, think about economy, etc., together with comrades who were in exile, other comrades who were in the country but banned or whatever, your Deleuze MGs, etc., but how we could bring together that kind of thinking across that. And I remember quite hot discussions, or a degree of sort of, who are you people? We're fighting for the liberation of the nation of South Africa. Why are you talking about local government? Why are you talking about regional provinces issues? And there was almost a lack of knowledge with comrades, particularly those comrades who were in exile, lack of an understanding of really what these movements, as Lachisa and Eunice have articulated there, which were happening right around the country, where suddenly comrades in Indian areas, that disjuncture between what whites were paying for rates and Indian were paying, became the means through which we could conscientize people about that bigger struggle to liberate everyone. And then you get comrades in the township areas who really had no services. They had no form of representation, dummy or not, etc. So that period of the 1980s, I think, really influenced what I'm sure Eunice is now going to get into discussion in the 1990s, when we had to bring together these four forces, those working, and many of us worked across the four sectors, as it were, but those who were involved in these daily struggles, whether it was around food or safety or workers or whatever. The second were those who were part of the sanctions campaign, and those governments across the world, progressive governments, who obviously wanted to influence the direction the ANC would move in, the kind of social democratic as opposed to, let's say, more socialist bent in the kind of more Sweden's, etc. The third of those being our underground, which begins being formed in that period. Underground was always there, but particularly Operation Vula. And when you talk to comrades like Mac Maraj at that stage coming into the country in the late 80s, because we still had that belief that seizure of power must be dealt with. However, the discussions around negotiations had begun there. And then obviously in Mkhonto the targeting of the armed regime then. So by the time we get to the 1990s, at one level, we're a bit unprepared for the negotiations, but we had to bring together all of these diverse range of forces there. And so maybe if you could then begin that discussion, Eunice, of the 1990s.
Yeah, very quickly, I think that Letitia should also come in, and I'm not sure whether I wasn't part of the white paper process, and I actually got involved when I went to the committee we started the committee work in June 1994. We were chaired then by Praveen, who was later appointed into the white paper committee, as I think was Letitia as head of Sanko. But very quickly, from our side, I became chair exactly when the white paper was finished. In fact, one of my first tasks was to attend, as did others of the members of the committee, at the Cape Castle formal launch of the white paper. So we had hearings, and then Letitia was in the committee shortly after that, I think, or then. And we used the white paper to process legislation, starting with the demarcation bill. And of course, you, Michael, were then appointed the chair of the demarcation board. A very apt choice, I must say. And you did the phenomenal, actually, you and your team. To do the demarcation, Letitia, I'm sure will have something to say. To do the demarcation in that limited period. I must say we were very skeptical for those of us in Parliament. But remember, I wasn't technically as sophisticated as you and others were with your background. But even those who advised the committee, most of them, I must say, Letitia, I wonder if you remember, when you talk to them, they said it won't happen. You will never be able to have local government elections, And we said, well, yeah, we're also doubtful, but we are where we are. Let's see what happens. And I must say, Michael, colleagues, what Michael and them did was phenomenal. I can't think of a better person to have done that job. It was phenomenal given the geographical spread. But there are many issues that arise about the white paper and the subsequent legislation, which there's no time to go into, given that we're already into 34 minutes. So I'll be very quick. What were some of the things? The one thing that struck me overall was a lot of the people that shaped that model came from what we might call the insiders. They were mostly UDF people. If you look at that first committee, we had the chairperson, president of Sanko, there in Letitia, right? You had the chairperson of the committee being the former key protagonist in the Durban Housing Action Committee. You had the secretary of the Peterborough Combined Ratepayers and Residents Association, for what it's worth, very conservative, Indian, colored-based, but with experience in municipal issues and the first attempts to secure an open city. You had Jomo Kasu. You had Letitia, you'll remember some of the names, who was also involved in some or other form in local government. You had other people there who had in some or other form played a role in the civic association, Kumisa, from Pedi area and so on. Letitia, you might remember, my memory fades me. But it was a very heavily weighted committee in terms of people who themselves came from the UDF and in some other form the civics. So that partly shaped the white paper, I think, and the legislation that flowed. One of the things that struck me as a Marxist, as it did left Democrats, left National Democrats, was popular participation from below. I really think the municipal system bill, as I once said to a journalist, was a glorious piece of legislation. It had everything that the UDF fought for, Letitia, everything we wanted. Popular participation from below. In fact, the then minister said to me one day, meeting me in the corridors as we were going towards Parliament, he says, hey, you know what? Why are you making it so difficult for councillors to function? Even if they have to go to the toilet, he said, they have to consult with the community. Everything. Performance management system, right? Budgets you cannot pass. Anything. Municipal services, if you restructure them, etc., etc. He says that nothing will happen. There'll be a consultation, IDPs, right? Now, what do you want? Now, obviously, Chippy Olver and Google Malloy, and what is the other one with the glasses, Lechisa? The one that studied at MIT, the woman, I forget her name. They may come back to me. They were all complaining to the minister, right? By that time, Lechisa had moved to become MEC, I think, of the Free State, of local government. There again, a very good choice, right? So I don't want to go on too long, but there are three things that strike me. One is the considerable space we gave for public participation. And that was a romantic outflow of the heady days of UDF. But also it was in our subconscious, I think, sort of like critique of the top-down approach of the exiles, I think. The national constitution and that whole CODESA as well not completely, but a lot of what was in the national constitution and the CA was dictated by those who came from outside the country, except for Cyril, right? And inside, I think what influenced us is the need for popular participation from below, as against a slightly more top-down approach. We came from that background. So what shaped in the local government model and the system and the legislation is an outflow of what we wanted. And in a way, it's a slight critique of the way the ANC, NEC comrades operated, who were mainly from outside, they were balanced, right? And then said that's popular participation. I suppose we'll deal with a critique of our own idealism, our own inability to see what we were leading to by our own ambitions and over-ambitions, our lack of rootedness in the ground, strangely, about what's to come, although we couldn't have foreseen that. So that's the one thing. Two is what struck us from the outset was this is going to be very difficult, the financial system. We were told that local government will raise 95% white paper, I think you all said, from its own sources. And we're skeptical because now it's wall-to-wall and the powers have been expanded, far more powers than they had under the apartheid system. The provincial government to us was less important than local government. Of course, it reflects where we came from. So that's the second thing, the financial model. The third was the relationship, particularly between provinces and local government. We foresaw that there will be tension. Some things we foresaw, other things we couldn't foresee, and other things we should have foreseen, but we didn't. And we'll take some responsibility for it in some or other measure, each of us, whatever role we play. Thank you.
Oh, that's brilliant. That period, and the reason I started with you, because you gave us a very nice sense of that, let's call it what was happening formally. But let's go back a little bit. By the time we get to the late 80s, early 90s, in each of the local municipalities, you spoke about your mayor in Pietermaritzburg, then in eThekwini, we had a National Party mayor, Venter, who was far more progressive than the DA or PFP mayors had been before then. And mostly and around the country that happened. And so in parallel, the Inzals, as you call them, to a large extent had established what became known as the Local Government Negotiating Forum. And it was a very important process then at the leadership level. That's why I'm leaving Lechisa to be after you. At leadership level to say, look, if that continues the route, it's going to really not necessarily obstruct. There was then discussion about how it will impact on the national negotiations that were occurring at roughly the same time. And that, to a certain extent, having someone like people like Pravin Valley Musa had come on the scene there, and all credit to Valley. I often argue with him, but the reality was he was the only deputy minister in that case, only minister I know of that in the 1980s would created something called the Local Government Coordinating Committee, and we would meet nationally, and it was around the country. I've got documents on that, and I just look at the people who signed registers there and the significance of those individuals, but all committed that they will find their own way to Joburg at least once a month as we were engaging around the white paper and other issues there. So the way you portrayed that, very good, because it had to bring together this national local government forum together with the need for a constitutional approach, bringing it into constitutional and then the white paper. And I think having people like Comrade Lechisa, Pravin you've mentioned, and the other comrades there, they had to bring that together because at that stage there were lots of tensions in our own ranks, as you know, from the more top-down approach that was occurring and the need to make sure that we really looked at those models that were emerging. Obviously, the Joburg comrades, they always believed that, if Soweto sniffs, then the whole country has flu. So they were sort of quite dominant in pushing that. Whereas those of us who came from places like KZN understood what the traditional leadership issues had to be addressed there or whatever. And I must say that leadership that was governing it, which hopefully Lechisa will talk about, as he talks about that 1990 through 95, 96 period, was very instructive in bringing that about. So over to you, Comrade Lechisa.
Thanks. I will flip around a little bit backwards and come back. But I wanted to say that part of the reason for the popularity of public participation was as a result of the experiences we had in objecting to what the system was doing, including racially dividing us in a problematic manner. And in fact, both the rejection of the coroner bills and the black authorities and things like this, including the Indian and colored representative structures, was itself what gave a thrust to popularity of popular engagement and participation. And that little phrase that said genuine democratic governance was gesturing to that direction. And in a sense, what it also meant was that we created, uh, in building civic structures, you'd remember, Mike, that we created the Joint Commuters Committee, for example, in addition to other structures that cut across the traditional demarcation. The objection of Hambanati and Lamontville was precisely a successful anti-problematic demarcation that we rejected. Incidentally, it was Brown Fisher who objected to the racial planning of wanting Africans to live in that location across a railway line away from what he called the economy that they have. Why do you want to exclude them? Are you crazy? This is at that time, this objection to the system of planning in a way that is racial and away from the economy that was jointly created. So we were inspired also by the knowledge that the nature of the structures that must emerge must be reflective of the kind of society we would like to live. I do think the exile story is important, but it also considers the number of commonalities around similar issues in which comrades in the work they were doing in the underground was contributing to that environment. It was a fascinating interaction. Sometimes some of our, but you remember we had a workshop in Windhoek, for example, towards the beginning of the late 80s and early 90s, and in Windhoek, and in Harare, an hour and a half from outside Harare, at the local government institute, where we met other jurisdictions, uh, countries that had associations of local government and so on. And in our discussions of what we would do here, we were also critiquing the local associations. The cities network emerged from the major cities, essentially, but democratized and made more progressive in its orientation and so on. So, but also extending association of municipalities not to be in the shape in which it was designed by the apartheid state. So both the critique of the old system and our proposal for alternative system were very powerful features of what informed the constitution making process. I think we were also influenced, if you remember, by stories of how the Freedom Charter itself was put together. That process was very influential in informing how to design the new system that would come up. But there was also a story, a debate around centralization and decentralization. And interestingly, what we decided was that in the country, we we want firstly to unite the country as a priority. And in any designs of systems, they must be such that they take on board political developments inside the country necessitated and or benefited from active local and regional processes to that direction. If you remember, Comrade Amanda Young was suggesting very strongly that we throw out the provinces and rather go for districts throughout the country, regions. Of course, because the idea was that it would make for better, not only management at that level of including local ones, but also that we wouldn't have to carry the sort of resources that a provincial system should require. The political consideration of that period prevailed, unfortunately, and rejected the idea of those districts and so on. So I thought it was a critical area. Part of the debate was also about the urban rural prioritizing. There was a tendency, felt strongly inside the civic movement across the country, that there was a tendency to be urban biased. That observation came repeatedly in the number of debates, discussions we had. This is why, in a sense, the integration, the urban-rural dynamic comes out very sharply inside the workplace in the recognition of the necessity for that. In fact, Comrade Andres Nel at Copter, he was in charge of finalizing the process for a dynamic, integrated approach to human settlements by local government of necessity, and the relationship with other folks or with other spheres of governance. One of the biggest issues that we were concerned about was the economic issues of. You remember Manflo said to me personally, "Well, Chisamtana, what can we do with bananas and sugarcane with the gold and diamonds in your place where you come from in the Free State?" I don't forget that because of the way she was saying it. And so it was a profound observation about what we used to call initially one country, a single tax base. But we shifted it soon after coming into government, the realization no amount of local taxes collected would deal with the backlogs that apartheid caused. The necessary arrangement, which was really reflected in legislation, must be about one country, one tax base, and divided appropriately. So the division of revenue and its assumptions, and this is where review questions must arise. Now, things that must be changed fundamentally in recognition of the bad assumptions that we made about how much local government can raise and how much would be necessary to meet financial requirements of sorting out those backlogs and so on. So it was as a result of the observation that because of the nature of the system as designed before we came in and the minute nature of some of those, people could argue that no, we'll raise our own taxes and so and carry that out. Once you included the urban and the rural, you include the traditional leaders, for example, areas of jurisdiction that equally contribute significantly to municipalities in the neighborhood in which they are located. It was an important part of recycling. We fought, Mike, when we talked about Paris in the Free State, because we were saying, look, there's no chance in hell that this place will have a tax base to write home about. Of course, then came the story later on of take away the small tax base that was enabling district to be able to operate with the resources they were getting to levies and so on. Once that was taken away, it simply deepened what was already a terrible environment financially for those structures to succeed. So in a sense, I think maybe one of the issues that at the heart of the problems was sorting out this relationship with traditional leaders. The Spluma, part of these big debates was precisely about what authority these guys had, the traditional leaders and some of the communities over management of the planning process. So the recognition of this, irrespective of those authorities being in place, that we are part of the same country, and we've always insisted that whatever happens in each of these areas, for example, environmental protection, which became one of the key issues that we drove, respects no borders, no boundaries. There's no way in which you can alone decide on issues like that. You will go, for example, place people, allocate housing in flatland, for example, in those areas. You will be rendering risk the population for which the country is responsible for and so on. So it's an area that not only sorting out the finances of areas across the country, the municipal structures and so on, as was undertaken during the setting up of the system. We said that we hope we will increase revenues to municipalities over time. That has happened, but it's still very limited compared to the challenge that continue to face.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. We're into the last 10 minutes or so. Sorry, what's that, Eunice? You about to? What's that? Eunice, unmute yourself or forever hold your peace.
No, it's just one thing that I got very wrong.
Yeah.
The problem we had from the very outset was the complexity of the powers and functions being local, municipalities and districts. Not so much local government as a sphere and provincial. That too was an issue. But the main priority, it was stimulated by what Leticia said. And he's right. The other big issue absolutely was traditional leaders. Thanks, that's all. I wanted to correct myself. When we came back to Parliament at the last minute, I think you were in the Eastern Free State at the time, to say, let's tinker with the powers and functions because we couldn't get it right before the elections. You remember that?
Yeah. No, that's right.
Can I just say
And in
this?
fact, that tinkering created its own problems. But Leticia, we'll all have the last quick bite now. And I want us to suggest that partly what we're doing now is just to touch on some elements of the framework that you think worked well, and then what were some of the challenges equally. Because remember, subsequent sessions are going to get into more detail about demarcation, finance, blah, blah, blah. I mean, for me, we mentioned this, we had this concept of metro and non-metro because we really didn't understand rural dynamic very well, but it was also, I think, over-determined by the kind of Soweto model, as it were, and not thinking even about all those smaller communities in the greater Joburg area that needed to come in, you know, your Wintervelds, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, the issue of powers and functions, which you've raised there. We hardly spent any time in trying to articulate that balance between national, provincial, and local. And that's created this problem that instead of us having that developmental state at local government level, we now have a compliance state because Treasury took over, they determined things, hundreds of circulars coming, flying at all of us. And the result was that. So for me, there were challenges in those. The 3 or 4 other challenges that we had was that we focused too much on political leadership as being the source of corruption and yet we've realized it's actually the administrators that are the source of the corruption and that. They're the ones who decide where money can be made, and then they corrupt our leaders. And I'm not saying it's not to a certain extent influenced by that, but you certainly see it today. The major problem that we have in corruption is around administrators themselves. The second issue that, again, will come up later, this political administrative interface there, which to a certain extent we got right, but we've got a weakness on the part of officials not prepared to take on political leadership when they need to. We've got a serious issue around competence, and that you can see all over. Still today, our major metros, every day you're reading reports about the fact that we're appointing people to positions where you need a professional engineer, and we're appointing people who are not professionals, for example. So those are some of the issues that I think as we end off this first chapter, and we'll have a chance to edit as well later on, and certainly the 3 of us will probably do a fair amount of editing of those. Eunice has already jumped in quickly now, but let's maybe just, if each of you could just reflect for 5 minutes where we were then in that heyday of the 80s and the 90s in particular, and where we are now. There are hugely wonderful things that I think have happened, but everyone focuses on the challenges and the things we haven't done. We have delivered a lot. Maybe the glass is only 75, 80% full, but there have been those. So if you could just reflect in your last 5 minutes each on what as the things that really have happened and should be continued, and then those that are challenges that we need to clap some people into shape.
Okay, firstly, I think I want to endorse the observation about weaknesses during the negotiation. Now, when I see the documentaries on negotiation, I see a big frame missing there. That is of local government. There isn't a frame on local government in those documentaries. And it's amazing. Myself and Magda were co-chairs of the local government negotiating forum. And we had an opportunity, I had an opportunity to speak at Edward Modlani University at their election conference there. They had just completed some research project, and one of the British guys who was operating in Mozambique invited me to go and speak. I'm citing it because part of what we also did, we did learn, interestingly, from the different international setups, including by Carl Wright of the local government forum at the Commonwealth and so on. They exposed us to significant considerations of what was happening with local government in the rest of the country. In fact, the reason that we advance is the idea, instead of local government being subject to a minister on being angry, destroying quickly, was precisely because of what we noticed happening in other jurisdictions. Those exposures externally was very useful and beneficial. But I was fortunate in that not only was I involved in the destruction of the old system, but also learning from people in that way. And then on finishing the legislation after the concluding of the constitution, I often tell comrades, as you said, go and implement this nonsense that we put together. So those 1999 to 2004 was an exciting period in local government as we put to bed the Systems Act, the Structures Act, and including in consideration of the integrated development plans, environmental protection and regeneration. In other words, sustainability was an important part of what we put on the agenda. And what we often do not speak about enough is the disaster management provisions that was transformational in input, placing emphasis on prevention rather than coming afterwards only, which was the old orientation. That, to me, says that Umtata, the reason Umtata thing is an example of the value of this preventative work that is necessary, and especially municipalities looking at vulnerabilities. Each pillar that is appropriate to do that. What new vulnerabilities are going to hit us in the next 10 years and so on. Long-term thinking as it relates to that part of the work was a, I think, useful intervention in our work. The necessary intergovernmental fiscal relations stories and so on are at the heart of what needs to change fundamentally in some respect because of what we are unable to do effectively. Obviously, I think what you said earlier on about corruption and ethical kind of work is an important part of the work that we have not succeeded, and we didn't sufficiently perhaps generate systems that would be stronger in prohibiting tendencies to that direction. But otherwise, I think most elements of the white paper was looking at it earlier today, and I found that no, man, this thing essentially, its key bones remain valid. And if there's a problem, is inattention to implementation of what we already recommended, including at the most basic level inside municipalities, coordination and integrated development. Not only within a municipality, but within a district and in the province, in line with the strategic development plans, as well as nationally, consideration for what priorities should go into those areas. It's inattention to that must be attended to, not necessarily change. This language of review is problematic for me because oftentimes what people are saying, they say they want to change, but they don't explicitly tell you what the hell is this that they want to change. Because it can also mean some people taking advantage, those who disagree with the principles that are very progressive, I want to suggest, that informs that local government process and the white paper in particular.
No, I think that's brilliant. And I mean,
Comrade-
certainly sorry.
Comrade Eunice, please, Moses Mayagisha was my president. That was his deputy. Became president subsequent.
Well, still, I mean, you were a key local.
No, you were key in terms of that. And I think your comment, I mean, I do think that you're in statements. I mean, I certainly concur with you. We did lots of studies for COGTA. This idea that the whole thing has to be reviewed is nonsense. I agree with you there. There are things that we can improve on, but we've got to be very careful that we don't inculcate this belief that nothing's done. Our municipalities are still at least working, not brilliant, but they are still delivering there. But certainly the last word to Comrade Eunice, who always needs the last word, but I might have to stop him after too many last words.
Yeah. You can time me. I hope you timed other people too. But very quickly. So let's start with this. I think we are all vulnerable to the suspicion that, look, we're defending a model that we in some or other way shaped. So, but I don't think that applies to us really. I think the underlying principles and values of the model that actually you two shape more than I remain valid. What needs to be changed are aspects of it But the values and principles and aims, they remain resonant even now. I think the great thing about what Paul did, and I to a lesser extent, is wall to wall. You also, I think, what the model did, I think it combined ward and PR very good. And I think that system should apply to some other extent in the national and provincial spheres. I also think that we broke out the mold of unitary versus federal. We had a system of cooperative governance, where each sphere is strong so long as it cooperates with the other two. So many of the problems that we have at local government, also because provincial government in particular, but also national government don't play their parts. So what happens in municipalities is a reflection as much on province and national as it is on local government. Then I also think that we gave people a sense of power, that they have right to participate, not just in elections, although that power gets abused by masses, particularly led by criminal and other elements. I also think that what has happened is municipalities have wriggled around. We gave also a unique definition of municipality as legally belonging, legally being not just the elected councillors and the municipal staff, but the public itself, that integrated system, the three things. And I think what we did, which was wonderful, and many other countries, let's just say, I remember they came to visit us in Parliament in the first 5 years, the Swedes, the Indians, and so on. They all, how do you get it right? You've got local government powers in the constitution. Elsewhere, where we have different spheres, if one party comes into power in the province or state or the national, and other parties are funding, they take their powers away. Then very quickly, we got some things wrong. I think we exaggerated and romanticized the power of the masses. We didn't foresee that the ANC would make local government a site of its own internal struggles. In other words, what happened was, instead of the municipal sphere, local government sphere, reinforcing the ANC, strengthening it, and vice versa, in a mutually interdependent relationship, because we're running most of the municipalities, what happened was, if there were internal factions within the ANC, REC, or BEC, it got translated into fights and power struggles within the municipality and between the district and the local. We have a classic example of the elections of an REC where the district was under one of the candidates for chair and the local was under another mayor and person vying for chair of the region. And so, the district and local couldn't work together because the regional conference coming up 1 year ahead. What we underestimated is our capacity for decay. And what you write about, Michael, I think, and I think Lechisa also will agree, but I can't speak for him, I think he'll agree. We didn't foresee, surely, Comrade Lechisa, that the municipal administration will itself become a site of struggle and will take on the councillors, and the councillors interfere, that political thing. But you know what? I think we meant well. Some of the things we should have foreseen, but some of the things were unforeseeable, right? Would you have imagined having a president, for example? How could we have foreseen that? Would say that HIV has got nothing to do with AIDS, or another that will allow Guptas. I mean, how could we have foreseen that in 1994, 1996, right? So there are some things we couldn't foresee. But you know what? Ultimately, local government remains a very powerful sphere. This country will never survive, will never develop unless we get local government right. And people in the national and provincial sphere and civil society must all cooperate with local government to make it work. That is a powerful sphere of government, a powerful sphere of democracy. And next year, please record this, in 2026-2027, Lechisa and I are convinced the Communist Party will show its power on the ground in the local sphere. Isn't that right, Lechisa?
Well, the difference between the two of you and me, as I used to say to Comrade Muna, he and I were in agreement.
We are idealists.
We need one person, one vote once. That was our problem. But thanks very much. I think this evening we've traversed quite a nice range of issues. And certainly it's, for me, being with two comrades who have always viewed as really good leaders, both intellectually, but also in terms of their own struggle to better the lives of ordinary people. It's been a pleasure trying to moderate this session. But all the best, and over to the organizers. One who's trying to run Tswane and messing it up. The other one who's sitting in Cape Town and doesn't even know how to overthrow the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. No, hopefully they'll wipe that out.
When you become bourgeois, it's difficult to want to overthrow your own class,
No, we used to call it committing class suicide.
There we go.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, colleagues, friends, comrades, this was such a fantastic conversation. We could have gone on for at least another 45 minutes to an hour. But you certainly set the scene and the stage for a fantastic contribution, a wonderful chapter. Mike, I think you've got a great basis on which to write that chapter.
Who said
Yeah,
I'm writing a chapter now? Hey, you just said we set aside an hour and you can just talk your head off. And no. By the way, I should just mention, I am in the process of sort of digitizing what archives remain, because obviously in the 80s is the weaker period because we had to lodge documents all over the place. But particularly the 90s, I mean, it's really, so I want to just get it out in digital form so that people can read there, because there is that rich, detailed history of those. You know, as I say, you know, those meetings that Valley coordinated at headquarters where we'd all drift in were really interesting periods there. That LGNF, for example, that you were involved with it. So I do think that out of this process, we've really got to make sure that whatever archives we've got begin to be accessible to people who will then go and write their own interpretations of it. But I just wanted to mention that as a separate issue now. I need some people who won't cost me much money to help me digitize. But anyway, that's a separate issue. Cool. But thanks.
Thank you very much.
everyone.
Johan, why don't I give you the last word and just to close us up. But thank you very much from our side.
Okay. Yes. No, thank you very much to Eunice and Lecheso and Mike. I've communicated with Ashraf and said this is probably the most valuable contribution of this project. We are on the verge of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And there's such a lot of principles that we are not recognizing. And I do think that this discussion, among all of the rest that we anticipate, but this one, is it going to set the record straight, and it's going to put us on a path where we preserve what must be preserved. So I want to thank each one of you. Thank you very much, comrades.